Lay down. Go. Go. Hello, lovelies, and welcome to another edition for Hold My Latte 2022. Today we are doing part 3 of world building for hashtag whip chat. And let's well, February's here and it has been more of 2022. I'm Mama Maggie Ward. I am a multi-genre fiction author and I love world building. It's my favorite thing. So last time we talked about cultures and characters, and we talked about the first week we talked about what you love and hate about world building and about white room syndrome and how to avoid it. White room syndrome is where you have no descriptors in your environment. It's just your character's basically stream of consciousness. There are some terms that are useful. When we use WIP, we mean work in progress. So your WIP world is your total universe of your work in progress. All the places, the characters, the things. A scene is the action or what is happening in a specific setting. And the setting is the location or place. It's the environment around where the action or interaction is happening. We talked about characters and how to make characters more interesting, how to give them some personality, some depth, how to make them more realistic, believable, engaging to your readers. Because you can have the best story in the world, but if you have white room syndrome or if you have that blank character, then your reader's not going to hang with you through the story. They're not going to stay there, and you're just going to be that you're going to lose them, and you don't want to lose them. So today, what we're going to talk about today is basically the how and the what. We're going to talk about creating interesting environments for your characters, creating interesting worlds, technology, magic systems, and we will be talking about hard and soft systems. Now, if you don't know what these are, the easiest way to think about them is, well, let's take Harry Potter. In the first book of Harry Potter, you have a very hard magic system. These are the rules. You cannot break the rules. In the third and beyond book of Harry Potter, you have a very soft system where the rules don't always apply if the magic or the willpower is there. So before we get into our questions, let's say hello. Hello, Megan. Welcome. And hello, Anita. How are you today? Thank you for coming to the live stream. I'm going to switch this. Okay, so let's see, where was I in my notes? I have just lost my place. Oh, I'm having such a 2020. So question 14 for hashtag whip chat, hashtag world building is, if you write science fiction, do you use a hard or soft technology system? And what can your world technology system do? Now, hard systems and soft systems, for technology, it's what can your technology do? Using sci-fi, let's use two very famous sci-fi systems. Star Trek. Star Trek, in spite of all of its posturing as being a hard sci-fi system, started as a soft sci-fi system. It started as the system that We have warp cores and we have shields and we have transporters and communicators that can go from the surface, little handheld things from the surface of a planet to a spaceship in orbit. And they never explain these things in the very early years of Star Trek. They never explain how these things work. And over the years, as science and theoretical sciences caught up with the science fiction, they began to offer explanations for warp cores use dilithium crystals to generate a field that bends space, that allows you to move significantly faster than the speed of light. And so it went from being a soft system to a hard system. However, as much as Star Trek wants to claim a hard system where these are the rules, they have to stay in the rules, we can't bend the rules. They are constantly bending the rules. And one of the one episode that always sticks in my mind when I talk about breaking or bending a hard science fiction technology system is the episode where they were trying to move this moon out of the way because it was about to fall on this planet. So they just needed to move its orbit. And Q was with them, and he had been banished from the continuum again for something. And so his solution to fixing the thing was just to change the gravitational coefficient of the universe. So they extend their warp field partially around the moon and try to pull the moon out of orbit, and it doesn't work. And because Q was selfless and helping them, he got his power back. And so he just flipped and changed the gravitational coefficient of the universe. Well, the sciencey person in me was like, there's a little problem with this. First of all, they would have torn the moon apart trying to do what they did. And then Q's solution of changing the gravitational coefficient of the universe would have had catastrophic effects everywhere else, because the universe is a pretty balanced system for how things move and how things interact and how things are spaced, and just changing that thing would have been a very bad thing. So that is the difference between a hard and soft system, is this thing will do this thing. Another example is Star Wars. Star Wars is completely a soft system. And the reason Star Wars is a soft system is because no amount of explaining or theorizing will make their technology work. Lightsabers alone. The problem with a lightsaber is the magnetic field required to hold the plasma in place so you can stab and cut and wield it like a sword would literally rip the metallic ions from your body. So that's why Star Wars is always going to be sci-fantasy. Star Trek is in that mostly science fiction, a little science fantasy. And if you want to look at like contemporary shows, the CSI series. The CSI series could be considered a soft fiction series because the technology they use, like taking fingerprints off skin or digitally enhancing a photograph to read a license plate or get a picture when you know the quality of the camera that took that, there's no way they can do that. Those are examples of non-fantasy, non-science fiction applications of a hard and soft system that is in other genres. It's in procedurals, in action movies. There's a lot of examples of hard and soft systems. And what the technology can do is unfortunately limited by what our current knowledge of science and technology can do and what we hope that it can do. All right, let's go on to, wait, I got to go to the other window. Where's the other window? I have lost a window. Hold on. Oh, there it is. Question number 15. Are there groups with more or less technology? Are there biases against technology or against those who are without it? This is a very interesting thing to add to your world, because in our world, in the IRL, we have groups that have technology that most of the rest of us don't own. And that leads to the idea that, cyberpunk, the whole idea of cyberpunk technology, where you wear your technology, where your technology is actually implanted. Not that we're all eventually going to become Borg, but that idea is there. And it seems like it is so close to us. And then we have groups in our culture, and they have pretty much reject technology. They have moved on, and they live in a world where they don't use a lot of modern technology. The Amish is the most commonly recognized example of this, but you can also look at tribal societies all over the world who have rejected technology to hold on to their culture. And there are biases. There are biases against the people who don't stand in line for 12 hours to get the absolute most recent, currently this minute's release of the iPhone. And then there are those of us who are like, look, I still have a flip phone. So the bias against technology, for or against technology, it adds a layer of conflict into your world that deepens your world build. It's another thing is how technology is taken for granted to the point that people stop using it. In my Relic of Time and Shadows war, after the war is won, well, let me start. During the resettlement, the survivors of the remnant of Etheria are living on Terra Earth in the city of Atlantia, which later becomes, in our myths, Atlantis. And they have all of this advanced alien technology that through the generations, they don't know how to use. No one knows how to use it. It just runs. And so that is another thing. I mean, today's teenagers, you say, yeah, we're going to go off somewhere and go camping, and you're not going to have a cell phone signal or Wi-Fi for a week. Well, that's just asking for a freak out, because unless you've been doing that with them their whole lives and they're used to it, suddenly dropping them in a place where they have no Wi-Fi or signal freaks them out. When hurricanes come in or tornadoes come through, one of the things that they actively seek to reestablish first is not power or water or food deliveries. It's the cellular Wi-Fi service, because people without their technology are much more freaked out. Like I said, in the Ethereans have lost, because they're kind of living more as an agrarian, peaceful society. They've lost their need to understand or know their technology. Oh, it's just there, it works. And that can be a very dangerous system. And that's a place where we are at culturally in the first world nations right now. We have so many people dependent on technology, and so many people who look at technology as just a given, that when suddenly they're in a place or in a country where they don't have all this technology, they kind of freak out a little bit. Whip chat question number 16. If you're writing a fantasy system, do you use a hard or soft magic system? What are the rules and consequences of magic? This goes back to the Harry Potter example. In Harry Potter, in the very first book, that you are introduced as a first-year Hogwarts students to the rules, a hard magic system. By book 3, those rules start flying out the window. By the time you get into Order of the Phoenix, the rules are fluid. In Lord of the Rings, it is a very hard magic system, because magic requires balance. In the Witcher series, magic requires balance. It is a hard system. These are the things you can do. This is the cost of doing it. So when you are considering world building, when you're thinking about a system, you need to think about these rules before you start writing your world extensively, because you need to have that. Is, how many elements are you going to have? What are the cost of the elements? What do you need to manipulate them? What do you have potions? Do you have enchanted items? Do they work on all species? Are they species specific? If you have like fae or dragons or changelings, are witches human, or are they something more than human? Werewolves, vampires, the whole mythical pantheon. That's the word I'm looking for. The whole mythical pantheon. How are you going to use this? If you do not think about this before you start writing, if you do not seriously think it out, you can alter it later. You can include things, you can add things. And I'm a hard system person. And so in Relic of Time and Shadows, which is my big sci-fi, sci-fantasy series, not everyone has the genetics to be able to manipulate the frequencies of magical energy, which turn out to be part of the universal background energy. Just like time energy, in which they store to use as an energy source. They store time, and so that's how they make it work. It can be very difficult. I mean, if you're writing a soft magic system, if you don't want to go through all of these steps to create this very complex thing, you can still write a soft magic system, but you need to be aware of the fact that you don't want your characters to just be able to go poof for this and poof for that, and instantly, your magic system isn't a genie that if your characters wish for it, it happens. So if you're writing a soft system, be very careful to not turn it into a genie. Question number 17. For hashtag whip chat, hashtag world building is, are there groups with more or less magic? Are there biases against magic or against those without magic? Enchanted items, magical creatures, what are the things in your world? Now, I've read a lot of stories where either A, possessing magic puts a target on you, or not possessing magic puts a target on you. Enchanted items exist in many, many stories. Harry Potter, there's tons of enchanted items. In Lord of the Rings, there are tons of enchanted items. In the Chronicles of Narnia, there were a few enchanted items, but it was more about the enchanted creatures. So how you deal with these things is something that you need to think about before you just throw them in the world, because you don't want to have something like, you don't want to have a dragon and then there's no limits on your dragon. So if you have someone who's a dragon rider, they basically have a god as a pet. So you need to have that awareness, not to go too OP, because it suspends the belief of your reader in your book. And the other thing is, a nice thing to add, secret societies or sects who possess magic or possess a special kind of magic, or like dark magic versus light magic wielders. This gives you a layer of conflict that exists in our society, not for magic, but for skill sets and stuff, that makes your world more engaging to your readers. And naturally, the whole thing with biases, well, it is almost a natural human state to find a reason to have a bias against someone. And if there's not a bias, unfortunately, our media will make up a bias just because they can. They just need the drama. Honestly, they're like a bunch of 16-year-olds. But I could spend a whole thing just talking about enchanted items, how levels of creating enchanting items, And magical creatures. Are they creatures that were enchanted? Are they creatures that are inherently magical? Are they creatures that have the ability to manipulate magic? All of these are things that you need to think about. And another thing is I use characters like in my series, like if a character overuses their magic, they will pass out. They have the potential to collapse and forever die. I love having biological explanations for magical creatures. And I get that from Anne McCaffrey. She's my all-time favorite artist. I love her to bits. She takes a very scientific approach to things that seem magical. For example, the dragons of Pern. The dragons of Pern are the result of a genetic experiment. They are biological creatures. There's nothing magical about them. And so that leans back into my sci-fi roots. But having some explanations, having my Relic of Time and Shadows War, my Quetzals, my four-winged feathered serpents that can belch fire. Well, they have a pouch in their stomach that creates basically a gas that will ignite when exposed to air as a vaporous form. So it's not a true fire. It's a vapor spontaneous combustion. It's a chemical reaction. So you think about how magical do you want your creatures and how mundane do you want your creatures? When you're enchanting items, here's one thing to think about. Relic of Time and Shadows. They have an enchantment that basically makes something indestructible. Inanimate objects, they can slow down the aging of creatures. However, that has a side effect. If you're a semi-immortal, you want your dog to live more than a decade, so you enchant it to live for a few centuries. The problem with that is that animal no longer has the ability to reproduce because their cells, even though they act like a normal beast, their cells are now much slower. The mitochondrial clock has been stopped. They are stuck at that age. If you enchant an item to be indestructible and to never wear out, well, that's a really good thing. But the side flip of that is it takes more magic to remove that enchantment than it does to put it on that enchantment. And so, while it sounds great that, oh yeah, we could make our favorite shirt so that it never wears out. But the problem is then when styles change, when fashion change, your favorite color changes, then you have a shirt that it takes more magic to recycle to be able to throw it away than it took to make it. So everything in balance. Okay, chapter 18 or question 18 is when you're creating your world, do you use a hard mapping system or do you have a fluid world? How is your world laid out in the macro and the micro? Do you make maps? Do you explore as you go? We talked about this a little last time about using Google Earth and to create maps and Encarta to make maps so that you can figure out where you're going. I like to base worlds. I have many worlds based in the IRL. My Pagosa Cliff series, Blue Water was the latest that just published last weekend. It's based in the real world. It is based in a combination of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, and Ouray, Colorado. So I have these two locations that I've kind of overlaid to create what appears to be a real world location. I have also used Nova Scotia as a real world location, the Manicouagan Reservoir as a real world location, Crater Lake as a real world location. And you can learn these places by looking at them. Literally, you can base plants and animals and buildings and cities on real world locations or real world things. When you are going through and you're writing your world, If you're fluid world mapping, one of the things you think about is if you add a new thing or a new element to this world, how is it going to change all the world you wrote before this? How is it going to change all the world you're going to write after this? So, having hard worlds versus fluid worlds, adding places that weren't earlier in an area where your characters were, be aware that you might have to go back, throw in a sentence or two, throw in a paragraph or two about, oh yes, this place is over here, and then you don't go there, because having some place just pop up, it's like Shangri-La. It just, you can't, having some place that just appears and then disappears, your readers will notice that. Chapter question 19 for Whip Chat, hashtag Worldbuilding. How detailed do you make your world layout? The variety of landscapes, towns, cities, homes, churches, government buildings, business buildings. Do you have airships, ocean ships, spaceships? How much do you describe or detail these things? Well, you do need to know the layouts of things. Like, you need to know if you're going to walk down the street and go left, you're going to go this. If you're going to go up the stairs and turn right, these rooms are there. You need to know that. I've mentioned this before. Zane Grey, he wrote literally hundreds and hundreds of Westerns that are pretty much the same 5 plots, but they happen all over the West and Southwest. And it's because he used old postal maps to like mark landmarks and homesteads and stuff, so he could write and it felt very real world. Now you can write completely fictional places and have them feel very real world. Like the roads in Paris, they all come into the center and they go out, and there's circular roads around them. The same way in Rome, it's like a giant wagon wheel. Washington, D.C. is laid out in a wagon wheel pattern. So one of the other things that you need to think about is like I'll even map weather patterns and star charts and create like ecopedias for worlds that I'm creating that have animals and plants and habitats. No one sees these things, but I'm happier knowing that I have them. And you know, it allows you, like, I remember one time I was watching an interview with Leonard Nimoy, and he said the hardest thing about going to the Star Trek conventions, the cons, and talking to people is people would ask, the fans would ask, well, what was behind this door on this deck in this episode? And he would not have an answer for that. Or they'd be like, what happened if this thing did, you know, and he would not have answers. And he goes, things that they originally never even dreamed about, never considered writing into scripts or anything, the fans notice and they want. So having these layouts of your thing, of your world, not just your world, but houses, churches, buildings, you know, do government buildings look one way? Do business buildings look another way? How do the churches look? How do the homes look? How do the towns in the rural areas vary from the cityscapes? How do the spaceships look? How do different ships look? I mean, if you go to a marina, you'll see a lot of sailboats, but you'll also see a lot of different kinds of boats. If you do airships, are they dirigibles? Do they have propellers? Do they have engines? How do these ships work? It's how detailed you make your landscape of the things in your environment it can be distracting, but it also, it's a balancing act, how far you go with it. I personally like all the details, and that's why I have huge world builds. But like you said in the very first video, you can get away with 1,000 world build. You don't have to go into all these details. But you can add to them as you're going. So keep that in mind. All right. Number 20. Question number 20. Are your communities separated or united based on environment, terrain, or class? How many different jobs do the places in your world require? And this might seem like a weird thing to ask, but like if you have a village, in that village, you're going to have a baker or a grocer, and there will be farmers, and there will be teachers and different levels. When you have a city, you will have people who work with technology, people who work for the government, people who work for the police, people who work for the medical. All of these different layers create like a cake effect in your world. And are there biases in our real world? Like there are biases between country folk and city folk. There are biases between people who like different types of music. There are biases between economic classes, upper classes versus, homeless people, or middle class or lower class. And even within those economic levels, there are biases. There are religious biases. The war between the Protestants and Catholics went on for hundreds of years. The war between the Christians and the Islamic Muslims went on for hundreds of years. There are still religious skirmishes going on around the world right now. Look at India. Look at Pakistan. Look at that area. In the Middle East, are you a Sunni or a Sharia? There are biases there. In our country, in the United States, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you an independent? And which of the 300 different levels of one of those three things are you? So adding the different levels of class, we talked about this in the culture, adds another layer of conflict. The other thing is does your terrain create a level of difference in culture and society between people? Because the people who live in the valley, like in Peru, in the descendants of the Incans, there are different languages, literally different dialects for every mountaintop and every valley. Does the terrain make a difference in how your people interact with each other? How do the fishermen on the coast feel about the high mountain dwellers and miners? How do they feel about the tribesmen and trackers and hunters of the tundra or the Great Plains? How do the desert dwellers feel about those who live in the very temperate, wet, forested zones? These people will have different cultures simply based on their different resources. They will have different ideas and different beliefs simply based on their different resource set. Now, if you're running in a cityscape for your thing, for your whip, that you have a very homogeneous resource base, but it is also dependent on your economic class. Not everyone can afford to run to the emergency room or the doctor. Not everyone can afford to buy groceries or pay their utilities. And so these are things that add to your world. They add conflict, they add relatability, they add interest. So having cult groups that are united by their environment or separated by their environment, it creates another layer of your world that gives it a more relatable feel. And I think the last question is number 21 is, how does climate, terrain, or natural and unnatural disasters affect your characters and their plot? We all know how hurricanes, tornadoes, flash floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, we all know how these disasters affect the real world. Terrain and climate can deeply affect how characters in a story live, how they work, how they fight, but it also increases the opportunity for the immersive value of your story to give the characters more than just a landscape to move through. One of the things I do in my Pagosa Cliff series, because it is a real world adjacent Colorado town, they are in an area that suffers from both wildfires and blizzards. And there's actually in one thing, because it was such a dry winter, a wildfire starts in February. And a approaching blizzard is what smothers it. Now, that might seem like a far-fetched thing, but that happened in Boulder County just a month and a half ago. They had a wildfire start, and the blizzard coming in the next day smothered it. So, writing a hurricane coming in and the evacuation, and it doesn't have to be like a hurricane or a typhoon like we have. You can write it for your science fiction or fantasy world. Maybe it's a natural storm. Maybe it's an unnatural storm. Maybe magic generated this storm or generated this flood, or a scientific experiment gone awry caused an earthquake, which caused a tsunami, which devastated a huge area. Natural disasters can be a very driving plot point in the background of your story. Just the same as unnatural disasters. In Relic of Time and Shadows War, there are different planets and dimensions with very specific biomes. Like I have this pocket dimension that's basically just called the Dust Kingdom, because it is a collapsed star that basically destroyed its own system before it was enclosed in a pocket dimension. And then I have another world called Arborea, which is a world that is basically a rainforest. The majority of the world is a rainforest. And there is all the water on this planet is under the ground. So when that world suffered a drought, it greatly affected everything on the surface, because all of the water is underground, because the level of the Great River, which is the water flow under the surface of the planet, shrunk, and everything on the surface began to wilt. Another thing is you can have expected disasters and you can have unexpected disasters. Expected disasters are every winter we expect the monsoon. We expect the snowstorms and blizzards. Depending on how far up on the latitude you are, you expect certain things in the climate to come at certain times of year. In springtime, we have tornadoes. Well, now we have tornadoes all summer too. But the expected disasters, you can kind of plan for them. You can kind of expect, have preparedness where your characters know what to do when this happens. And then you have the unexpected disasters, like earthquakes. You live in an earthquake zone, there might be an earthquake, but there's still not, it still pops up and you're like, oh, it's an earthquake. Another form, like the dinosaurs, they adapted for millions of years as the climate shifted around them from warmer to colder, wetter to drier, and back. They adapted. They moved through the landscape as it was changing. And then Chicxulub. One smack of a meteor and no more dinosaurs. Well, We still have chickens, but don't tell them they're not really dinosaurs. So one of my things in one of my series is I have the Dust Kingdom is the home to an entity called the Devourer, and it literally will open holes into the overworld and feed on the biomass of planets. It will harvest the surface up to 30 meters to get all the biomass of a planet to feed itself and the things that live within it. So that would be an unnatural disaster. You could have in a lot of the dystopian novels, the YA dystopia, society has collapsed in many of these situations, and nobody exactly knows what the disaster was. Was it a war? Was it a plague? Walking Dead, it was a plague. So having disasters and how your characters react, live, and either move through these disasters, face these disasters, or recover in the aftermath of the disasters can add a very relatable level to your story. Because people are resilient, characters should be too. Yeah, they can have their breakdown, but when the choice is find a way through it or lay down and die, unless it's written into your character profile that they're the type that's going to lay down and die, they will strive to try to survive whatever you throw at them. So don't worry about it. And that is the end for our quick study on world building for world building tips. Anita says climate plays a big part in my fantasy trilogy, as the setting is on a ship. Is it a spaceship or is it a ocean voyage ship, an airship? What kind of ship is it? I'm very curious. Let's see. I know we covered a lot today and this, but I put the questions down below. So if you want to look at the questions, copy the questions, answer the questions, you can do that. Oh, it's a sailing ship. So you have to face disasters at sea, tsunamis and typhoons and doldrums and things. That's very interesting. Good examples. The one example, speaking of Anita's book, that I can think of off the top of my head is Waterworld, where everything melts and the seas basically rise up and cover the majority of the land. That's a disaster. That is an interesting setting. There's a lot of steampunk that's based where pretty much everyone has moved from like the surface of the planet and they're living in floating cities or giant airships that move and they travel on the wind or they travel using the sky as their road. In steampunk, there was one steampunk where the cities, the atmosphere was toxic, and so the cities were domed, and they used tubes. It was almost like a space colony, but it was the planet. There is a lot of potential with your world building, but to avoid some of the pitfalls that like create plot holes that you'll have to write your way out of or write your way around later. Just doing some base work for the world building, deciding whether you're going to have a hard system or a soft system for your technology, a hard system or a soft system for your magic. Are you going to have a hard class system or a soft class system? How are the things in your environment going to affect your characters beyond the map of their world? There are so many ways to build out a world. An excellent resource is World Anvil. I'll put the link below. And it gives you a template for starting to world build. And if you want to just browse around it, there are lots of different places you can browse around on World Anvil to figure out how you want to build your world, how you want it to look. Again, I will say the game Minecraft is an excellent resource for world building creatively or for world exploring by just generating a random map. This gives you the ability to have something you can see to start off with your world building. You don't have to do a lot. You don't have to do gigantic encyclopedias of world building. You don't have to do a wiki for your world build. You can do 1,000 words. You can do the small details. You can add to it later. If you really want to get writing, you can world build as you go, but keep the awareness that when you change something in your world downstream from your start, you're going to have to go back and adjust the rest of your world to that point. So it's not just a bomb you drop on your world build. That's all I have for you today, my lovelies. We've been on about 47 minutes. So leave your comments below. Feel free to answer the questions and copy them. Thank you for joining us for hashtag WhipChat World Building Part 3. I hope that you have a lovely week, that you scribble much, and that you are blessed. And let me pull up my outro. It's not sharing. I don't know why it's not sharing. Hello. How are you, Heather? Oh. Well, thank you for coming. We appreciate it. I do.